I've been thinking a lot lately about life and death, because you don't choose life, it's just kind of hurled upon you at birth. And people, for the most part, they don't choose to die either, though, you know, occasionally people do. And that's a bit of what I want to talk about here, because life is hurled upon you at birth as either a gift or a burden, though we almost always meet birth with a kind of joy and celebration. And it's very rare, really, to find anything like we find like the words penned in the book of Ecclesiastes that say the day of death is better than the day of birth. Death, for the most part, is feared, avoided, mourned, in contrast with the smiles that surround the beginning of life. We're dealt a hand of life, and then typically we cling desperately to that hand in our avoidance of death, while death, unlike birth, does actually stand before us as an option to be freely chosen. There are relatively very few people that ever embrace death as an act of the will. Generally, there are two types of people that do that: the suicide and the martyr, typically one we despise and one we honor or praise, though both of them make a decision of the will to cast off existence, life, as a free expression of their will and choice. G.K. Chesterton, a brilliant author, English writer, Catholic theologian, philosopher, journalist, biographer, really the list goes on and on. He's one of my favorite writers, by the way. I highly recommend him, especially his book Orthodoxy, which I'll put a link to below. Anyway, the difference in the martyr and the suicide, that basically the suicide insults everything in existence by not considering it worth living for, that there is nothing worth staying alive for, whereas the martyr is different because the martyr has found one thing so valuable, so important, that it would throw away everything else for the sake of that cause or that purpose or that meaning or that one thing. And so this is why he puts them on opposite ends of the spectrum, and why the suicide would be despised and condemned while the martyr would be praised and honored. I agree with Chesterton's assessment, though I still think that a wise man would not take suicide off the table as a very real option. Why? Well, for starters, because it is actually an option. It is a possibility among other possibilities that stand before us, but also because of the value of choosing itself. You know, it was said by the philosopher Albert Camus that the only real philosophical question, the heart of all philosophical questioning, is the question of whether or not to commit suicide. Shakespeare's Hamlet opens with the question, to be or not to be. And while this may seem at first to be dark and disturbing questions, it really presents a very real and human dilemma. We did not choose to be born. 35 years ago, I was brought into this world. It's in the 35 years that I've lived since then that I reflect on now, and I wonder what it is that made me decide to stay alive, to choose life. And did I ever choose life? Did you ever choose life? Have you? Did you? Because it seems to me that it's only really by facing the actual possibility of death that we can choose life. And it's a choice that takes courage to not just merely be one that continues to exist and merely avoids death because you're biological. I remember in this book, The Brothers Karamozov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, also just a great novel. There's a section in it, more of a philosophical section, called The Grand Inquisitor. You can actually get that much thinner in its own copy. I'll put links below. But Ivan, this character, would say, I have decided to live until 30, and then I'm done, and I will dash my cup to the ground. What is one to make of these kind of comments? We're forced by these comments and questions to acknowledge that not dashing one's cup to the ground is a choice. You know, I'm excited about the prospect to choose, to have real choice about the question of life. To be or not to be really is the question. And I'm reminded of the opening monologue of the movie No Country for Old Men. The monologue ends, and so begins the movie, with the idea that one would have to choose to look at the world and say, okay, I'll be part of this world. It's the question itself that forces one to decide that the flower is worth living to smell, that the baby is worth living to raise, that the world is worth living to change. Chesterton criticizes the suicide for not valuing anything in the world enough to choose life. I would probably extend that criticism to those that don't actually choose life but just continue to exist. this kind of just continuing to exist is why I think, and what intrigues me about our culture's fascination with the living dead and the zombie apocalypse. It may not be as fantastic and absurd as we think of it. I mean, there are so many among us that are actually dead men walking. Like zombies, we just roam from scene to scene, consumed without regard for the cost and compulsive addiction to escaping death or pain or any reminder of that great fate or decision that hangs over our heads. We also relate to those uninfected that are fighting to stay alive. We, like those survivors, are not a lost cause without a hope of recovery. As are, say, the undead, we actually still have a choice to make. And in the zombie movies, we sometimes see people take their life. And it's in these vignettes that somehow we're understanding. And we understand because of the way that the world is that we get it. Well, why? Isn't Chesterton's criticism still relevant? Shouldn't we still condemn this decision? Why are we more understanding of these fictional suicides? Is it because death was so imminent anyway? Is it because the world was so dangerous and scary and filled with pain? But isn't that always true? Isn't real life dangerous and scary and filled with pain and loss? And isn't death the only real thing that we can actually count on? It is in the honest look that acknowledges pain and suffering and death, along with love and family and joy and all of those things, that one can fully choose life. If we understand the suicide in the middle of the zombie apocalypse, we should be able to understand the suicide of, say, a friend that wakes up and looks at the world and sees droves of zombies, loses hope, and dashes their cup to the ground. If we choose life, it seems that our deepest reasons should transcend the conditions in which we find ourselves. We still might criticize the suicide with Chesterton, whether it is our friend or a character within the apocalypse, or we might praise the hero that lays down his life for the sake of another. The man who chooses life may drink death like wine, and the man who only is just avoiding death is never actually alive anyway. The choice is ours. So rather than just being living organisms that will naturally do anything to stay alive, we must decide what life is worth and how we shall spend it. So today, I'm choosing life. I'm choosing the pain and the struggle and the joy and the love, and I'm choosing it once again. And tomorrow I gotta look in the mirror and do the same thing. So what do you think? Is this some just morbid and dangerous thinking that I shouldn't have shared in the first place? Do you agree that a wise man would leave the choice on the table? Have you made a decision to choose life? If so, let us know why in the comments. I look forward to hearing from you. Choose life.